Welcome to yet another installment of the International Writing Program's Friday panels here at the Iowa City Public Library. I would like to start by thanking the staff and the administration of the ICPL for allowing us to use the locales, and as always, throw in a thanks to international programs, in particular Downing Thomas, who is the supplier of that hot pizza going fast in the back row there. This panel is being streamed live on the ICPL website, and you can also find these, and as a matter of fact, all the ICPL panel presentations all the way back to 2002 under the archive tab on the IWP website. My name is Natasha Derbyshire, and I'm the editor at the International Writing Program, and I also teach the translation workshop together with Chris Merrill, who's over there. And we also every week teach an International Literature Today class where our students think about some of these issues that will be front and center in today's panel. Even just a decade ago, this panel used to be about translation in the classical sense, about ways in which a story or a poem in a source language is converted to the formal equivalent in a target language at some specified exchange rate. In itself, this is a fascinating process, especially for its many practitioners who ponder, attempt, and execute this Rubik Cube-like reconfiguring of words inside their heads 100 times over for each page. With the gradual change brought about by the near-universal connectivity, whether you call it globalization or the internet, however, this classical model of translation has gradually begun overlapping with a more complicated, weirder even, way in which languages meet, intermingle, talk to each other, cohabit. The prompt for this panel was therefore written to address this shift, and this is what we asked writers to talk about today. So let's see how closely they'll stick to the assignment here. So the assignment was language on the fault lines. As metaphor and as reality, in our ever more hybrid world, translation and polylinguality are now ubiquitous. Languages live side by side, commingle, influence each other. New words, accents, grammars, forms of data are surging everywhere. A writer may switch between languages within a single piece of work, or may self-translate, or may, like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, deliberately refuse to avail herself of a major language for the benefit of a minor one. Do you too live, create, think on that linguistic fault line? So this would be good enough as a starting point to introduce today's panel, but I couldn't resist the temptation to bring in a very recent event that has us all extra excited. Now it's not the impeachment, rather the Nobel Prize for Literatures that were announced yesterday. One of its two recipients, the one for 2018, is the Polish novelist and essayist Olga Tokarczuk, who serendipitously, yeah, see, accents, yeah, there we go. Today somebody self-corrected on NPR. I thought that was so sweet of them. For the past decade been translated into English by, together with a British colleague, by Jennifer Croft, an alumna of our MFA in Literary Translation program. Jennifer hit the big news yesterday. She had 20 minutes on the Canadian Public Broadcasting, long interview. But she will be coming to Iowa City to teach a workshop for the next couple of weeks, starting next week. So those of you who are around can get your books, Tokarczuk books signed by her. Last year, Jennifer's translations of Tokarczuk's book Flights won the Distinguished Man Booker Award. This year, Jennifer's and Antonia Lloyd-Jones's translations into English surely made the Nobel possible. For as far as we know, no member of the Swedish Academy's prize committee reads Polish, though they might read one of the many dozens of European languages into which Tokarczuk's work has been translated by others. So here's an excerpt from Tokarczuk's novel Flights, in which a Polish traveler sitting at an airport ruminates on what it means to be the speaker of a decidedly minor language, feeling compassion for those relegated to live in the exclusionary zone of the global power language, English. This is what she's thinking. There are countries where people speak English, but they don't speak English like us. We have our own language hidden in our hand luggage, in our makeup cases. We only use English when we're traveling in foreign countries and with foreigners. It's hard to imagine, but English is their real language. Often they're only one. They don't have anything to turn to or to return to in moments of doubt. How lost they must feel in a world where every instruction, every word of the stupidest song, restaurant menu, the most trivial business correspondence, even the buttons on the elevator are in their private language. When they speak, they can be understood by anyone at any moment. Their notes probably have to be specially encrypted. Wherever they find themselves, everyone has unlimited access to them, everyone and everything. There are already plans, I've heard, to give them protected status, perhaps even to assign them some small language, one of those dead ones that no one needs anymore, so that they too can have something for themselves of their own. So, from this vantage point, one would never want to live anywhere else other than behind a linguistic fault line. I have a couple of announcements, and then I will introduce the speakers. So the announcements are sparse today because the writers will be traveling next week. However, tonight we hope you will join us across the river in the Theatre Arts Building at 8 p.m. for Global Express, a night of theatrical readings to mark the end of the first part of the fall residency. The performance will be in the Alan McVeigh Theatre, and I have to say it's always a totally delightful event and one that has been very, very intensely stage managed by Lee Marshall, who deserves an extra credit for this. The writers will be traveling next week, but back in time to resume our Sunday Prairie Lights reading series on October 20th. The reading will feature Carlos Gamero, Clara Chow, and Dakota Parabag from the MFA playwriting program. And now let me introduce our readers, and I hope I have not lost the bios. No, I haven't. All right. They are, I'm going to read them in the order in which I have them, and that's probably the order in which they will read. So even though they're sitting, they just see, no? They read in that order. Okay. I stand corrected. We start with Robert Gall, who's a writer, literary editor, and publisher working at the intersection of genres and media. His 6 volumes of philosophical prose have been translated from his native Slovak, his and my native Slovak, into English and Czech. He has also collaborated with composers, dancers, filmmakers, and visual artists in performance and installation work in Europe and in the US. And his participation is courtesy of the US Department of State. Next to him, in that gorgeous white outfit, entirely unseasonal too, is Samuel Menghesteab, from the IWP's first ever participant from Eritrea, who writes fiction, nonfiction, drama, and poetry, and is passionate about creating a culture around Tigrinya language literature, of which I think we will hear more today. To that end, he has co-founded, edited, and contributed to several Tigrinya magazines and newspapers. He's the author of the Tigrinya story anthology, the title of which I shall not pronounce, and the writer and assistant director of the popular Eritrean TV series, the title of which I shall also not pronounce. He also teaches adult and youth theater and literary programs and writes pop song lyrics, and he participates thanks to the State Department funding. Next to Sam is Chan-Lai Kuen, a poet, interdisciplinary artist, public speaker, and teacher who won the Recommendation Prize at the 11th Hong Kong Biannual Award for Chinese Literature for her poetry collection, There Were Cats Singing. She also has published a prose collection and a bilingual Chinese-English volume of poetry. Her work has been translated and published internationally, and she has been funded by the Robert Ho Family Foundation. And finally, we will close with Amira-Gehanne Khelfallah from Algeria, who is a journalist, a novelist, a filmmaker, and a playwright. Her plays Les Draps and Chants et les Poissons du Désert have been published. Her debut novel, Le Naufrage de la Lune, appeared in 2018, and she has written and directed 2 short films, the first of which has been screened at several international film festivals. A feature film is in development, and she participates thanks to a grant from the State Department. Please help me welcome our panelists. Who is reading the first? Yes.
Okay. Nice to be here, and I'm happy you came. I prepared a short essay on the topic as I see it. A short meditation on language and love. The imagination is not a state, said William Blake. It is the human existence itself. If we were to replace the word imagination by the word language, we wouldn't be far from the same truth. Yes, it's obvious that language is more than just a tool, and not only for writers, because it's not only writers who need to communicate. Language is the building material of what we are building and the building itself. How the building looks is dependent not only on its content or what we are saying while using it, but also on its form or how we are saying it. Writing is to me a way of thinking. As I mentioned in one of the earlier panels here, and thinking is not only about ideas, but also about forming and formulating them. Our language, of course, is an inevitable part of it. Another interesting thing is that language is simultaneously a coding and decoding of reality. And as it is a permanent process, we might call it learning. Learning by experiencing and thinking. Learning by writing, listening to sounds, and listening to silence. Learning by listening to the inner rhythm of each sentence and each word in it. My writing was always about experimenting, about different ways of getting from one point to another. A point was something of value, and I have always tried to make my language connect to that. And very soon I realized how important to me is to keep my writing brief, terse. After I started to write, I started to enjoy being trapped in words, in the language I was creating, from the language I knew, or better, thought I knew. Because how can one know any language? In one sentence of my book, Naked Thoughts, published in English translation this year, is written, "Know one's language, but only ever as far as the next sentence." What does that mean? One interpretation could be that as we use our language, we are so deeply immersed in it that we can't see anything around us, exactly like when we are in love. We are blind. And we are blind partly intentionally because we prefer to be blind before seeing what we do not want to see. When we write, and it doesn't matter what language we are using, we need to be blind simply because we need to be in love. That is our only one language that matters. Everything else is secondary. On another page of the book I just quoted from, it says, "Writing is like artificially supplying what is already given, if that is what we take life to be, a system of structured infusions of this or that language where content only comes second. What is primary is the desire to quench the hankering after one's own thing, which keeps refracting into myriads of new possibilities and manifestations of them in reality. It is like dipping a hand into an infinite aquarium of swimming fish diamonds that have been, since time immemorial, a fundamental part of each and every one of us, except we haven't seen them until this occasion. Awareness of the fellowship between the fisherman and the catch affords us the certainty that anything that we seize upon is ours a priori, and that is what rescues us from a sense of loss. But then, how can we conceive of gains, since we are swimming in an aquarium that is ours anyway? Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Everybody is looking at my white dress because it needs also a translation. We wear these clothes in happy events. That's why I'm wearing this. So I will read my paper. Thank you for coming here. My name is Menghesteab. As you see, I'm reading about language between the fault lines. Most of my readings are originally in Tigrinya, English, and Amharic. I read translated works of English and translations of translations. I feel some cultural spirits and values are lost in translation. I write primarily in Tigrinya. Tigrinya is spoken in my country, Eritrea, and neighboring Ethiopia. As language is integrated with culture, some words become the extraction of cultural experiences. Knowing different languages can help to create new expressions and ideas in your language of mastery. In some cases, the grammar of one language can change the idea in the writer's mind and can give new perspective. When we are thinking, we are influenced by the cultural context of the language that we are using to imagine. In this process, there are some words that cannot be translated completely or partially into other languages. To have full understanding of a word, we need to know the culture and its values. Every language causes us to think differently. For example, if I said mawat in Tigrinya, the closest translation to English is toothbrush. In this case, toothbrush can only express the purpose. It cannot evoke the image of the object, which is also part of the culture. We say kal alam in Tigrinya, but it's too far from its English translation, nibble. There is no ghost in Tigrinya culture, but sometimes we talk as if we have seen a dream about someone dead. Imagine the difference between the words dream and ghost. This difference shows that sometimes we need to use the exact word as it is. Switching from one language to another can give a writer a new approach to a complete spirit of reflection. In Tigrinya, thank you can be said in different ways, but in English, the expression of thanks is generally limited to thank you or I appreciate. In Tigrinya, if someone lent me a toolbox, I have to say yaqanelay. If someone gives me a priority, kibrati haballay. If someone gives me water to drink, I have to say tsabasita, which can be translated as drink milk from the hands of God. If I got help from people much younger than me, I have to say hasab al-bakhas miralka or mar'a khair ena, etc. In English, the subject is I, but in Tigrinya, the subject is God. The main writing language of the writer and culture are two interrelated elements which come into play with idiomatic expressions, quotations, setting, and character. I consider a direct translation of the expression Ramatz wad guhari kuttu wad nabri. The possible translation can be Amber is the son of a coal glow, Feroz is the son of a leopard. But Ramatz is a very hot ash and the last remains of fire that cannot be easily distinguished from its heat. Hot ash does not equal to amber or smolder. I want to demonstrate that translation is beyond conversion of ideas like a unit. It comes out of transforming concepts to get the acceptance of another reader. It is a means of reflecting the philosophy of society. If an Eritrean says, let's go home and drink coffee, the invitation is not just for a private, casual sit down. If you don't have more than 2 hours, you don't have to accept the invitation because it means visit, chat, and have fun with the family. Sometimes you go for a coffee, but you find yourself eating dinner and laughing for hours before the coffee ceremony starts. I believe a translation has to show cultural differences to the reader. Imagine when you are translating an idiom or word that it demands another wider translation. Sometimes one word can be translated through an entire chapter. Instead of translating one idiom with another comparable idiom, it's clearer if the idiom is translated as it is used in the culture of the character. Switching from language to language helps a writer to create the exact expression and virtue of a character to seal a culturally based image in the mind of the reader. Thank you.
Hi, hear me? Today my topic is writing in betweenness. I am a Hong Kong writer and I write in Chinese, but which Chinese? I speak Cantonese and I write in Standard Modern Chinese. Standard Modern Chinese, with its lexicon and syntax very similar to spoken Mandarin Chinese, is the lingua franca among mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Southeast Asian Chinese, and other Chinese communities in the world. Speakers of Cantonese and Mandarin Chinese cannot understand each other if they have not acquired the other's language. Some call it dialect, in school or by active learning. Users of written Standard Modern Chinese, however, can understand each other in general, though there are subtle differences depending on the region of the writer. Although I acquired the skill of writing in Standard Modern Chinese in school as a child, that does not automatically mean that I have learned spoken Mandarin Chinese. It wasn't until I went to university that I learned the latter. Let me illustrate the differences of all these linguistic forms with an example from a line of my poem. You see below there's some scripts. And the first one is the written form. You just look at the thing, and it means that cats take the subway at rush hour. The English translation goes like this. The second one is what it sounds like in my head. That is a written Standard Modern Chinese pronounced in Cantonese. 死去的貓在繁忙時間搭地鐵. The number 3 is what it would sound if it is written out in spoken Cantonese. 死咗嘅貓喺繁忙時間搭地鐵. The fourth one is what it would have sounded if read aloud in spoken Mandarin Chinese. I'm scared because there are Mandarin Chinese speakers here and my Mandarin sucks, and please pardon me. 死去的猫在繁忙時間搭地鐵. Okay, when I wrote it in my head, it sounded like number 2 above. That is, and during poetry readings in Hong Kong, we also read it aloud with that pronunciation. That is to say, the poem is read in a literary way of pronouncing Cantonese that is different from our everyday speech. Usually, we do not write in the spoken form, that is number 3 above. Not that we are ashamed of our own language. Quite on the contrary, many of us are proud of it. But as a tradition, we have learned a specific form of writing in the form of Standard Modern Chinese with a Cantonese pronunciation. Therefore, it is less common for us to put in script the speech form of Cantonese. It might in fact be slower for a native Cantonese speaker to read such script because we are not trained to read in this form. For example, a professor can give a lecture on philosophy in spoken Cantonese, but it is unusual to transcribe the lecture directly as colloquial Cantonese for readers. So, does colloquial Cantonese have a place in Hong Kong literature? The answer is yes, it does. Poets and novelists have some pieces written in Cantonese which occasionally have the words of the colloquial mixed in their standard Chinese writings. For example, Mr. Tong Kai-Cheung, an alumnus of the 2009 IWP residency, has written part of a novel in the spoken form of Cantonese. Plays are commonly written entirely in the colloquial. That said, even apart from deliberate attempts to add a few Cantonese words in a spoken piece for a localist or humorous effect that is characteristic in Hong Kong writing, the Standard Modern Chinese that I use in my writing may be different from that of writers from other regions in the Chinese reading world. There are a couple examples of this difference from one of my poems, Phantom of Pain. I found myself using expressions closer to a more condensed form of classical Chinese or the earlier style of modern Chinese. For example, 是否, it means is it. More common standard Chinese form is 是不是, 是不是, and 抑或是, it means or. This is occasionally used but not very common among Mandarin speakers. I hope I have not mistaken, because when I wrote this, I made a poll in Facebook. There are writers from originated from different regions that have answered me, but I might be wrong though. 抑或是 or means or. This is occasionally used but not very common among Mandarin speakers. A common version is 或者是, 或者是. Cantonese has a long and storied history in ancient China, so these classical expressions are well incorporated and don't come across as archaic to Cantonese speakers. While written Chinese, as pronounced in Cantonese, is also my native language on top of spoken Cantonese, for me there is always a veil of foreignness about it. My spoken self completes a tiny ritual of switching to the literary self before I can start writing. It gives me a sense of yearning. When I read my poetry aloud, it doesn't have the same intimacy as when I hear a reading in English or any other language that I know. Languages that could sound like a direct speech or whisper from the writer to the reader. On the other hand, this linguistic transition from speaking to writing creates for me a distant planet that serves as a home for my literary self alone. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I will read a text that I titled Because They Don't Know the Sea. As far back as I can remember, the most memorable discoveries have reached me by the sea. I have always lived near the water. It is my source of inspiration. When I started writing, the sea was never far away. And then, one day, it became one with my work. It became its organ of life. I like listening to the songs of sailors. They are often full of nostalgia, but never complaints. The people of the sea come first to hope. They know that everything is possible. Perhaps it is this enthusiasm that drove me to them. To write my book, The Wrecking of the Moon, I went to meet sea people. And then one day, they let me get on their boats. I was attentive to their gestures. I wanted to pick up on their slightest movement. I was listening to their hands. I wanted to get the signs, imagine their untold stories. Their bodies are subject to narrative, exposure of the essence, mechanics of memory. I was fascinated by the ancient, almost sacred aesthetic that had been passed down from their ancestors. Over time, I learned to look at things more closely. I established a kind of body grammar where the actions and postures of sailors have been inventoried and described. I felt sometimes like a choreographer, sometimes like an anthropologist trying to work on the movement. In the economy of gesture or in the display of expression, there is a multitude of meanings, links between Mediterranean, the translation of thought, the art of interpretation. I learned to understand the language of their bodies, their way of speaking without speaking. I, a lover of words, was fascinated by sailor silence. Still, somehow, I was hardly surprised to hear them talk. Once on the boat, there was change, and the transformation was not partial but complete. I don't know when, but everything rocked. Voga, Sia, Mola, they shout. I can still hear their voices. Fishermen speak an ancient Mediterranean language that has survived several centuries. The language of sailors, pirates, prisoners, soldiers, renegades, slaves, leftovers, that of the damned of the earth. This lingua franca, qualified as liminal, language of transition, of those who wait in between, Métis language that has resisted because it has never been considered as language in its own right. It is the language of all foreigners, maybe those who are now illegally landing in Europe aboard boats of misfortune are inventing a new one, a language of sharing and waiting, a language of distance and hope. I recorded and transcribed the words of sailors. I listed them in a small notebook, and that is how I found the words to write my book. I finally found the words of the sea. But to understand where I'm coming from, let's navigate back to Earth. On land, it was decided that the Arabic is the official language of the nation, ignoring other languages, identities, minorities. All means have been put in place to serve this cause. We have worked to forget our roots, our differences. The authorities controlled the mountains, the plains, the schools, the administrations, the billboards, the television news. They were in the streets, in our houses. They wanted to inhabit our dreams. The alienation was pushed to the point where lectures on the Amazigh language were banned, sounding the knell to the first Berber Spring. In all this madness, the sea has been preserved because the Mediterranean has never been regarded as a semantic area. The sea remains the last refuge of our lost languages.
Before I open this to other people's questions, of which I'm sure there are many, I wanted to ask you, did you write your papers in English, or what is the relationship between what was in your heads and what is on those pieces of paper? Because they're very different, four very different texts, and yet they all come out so elegantly. Did you translate? Did you self-translate? Did you self-translate with Lee's help? How did I get, where did the words come from?
I write it in French first, and then I translate it, and we submit for editing.
Yeah, and like when?
I wrote it in English, but of course with Lee's help in making them more better. But it's very strange to write in English about the intricacies of the Chinese language.
Right, that's in part what I suspected, but it came out great. Sam?
Originally, I wrote it in English, but late. Make the editing, and it becomes perfect for me. I love it.
Yeah.
And I also wrote it in English, and then I sent it to my translator, David Short, to England, and he edited it after me.
Yeah. So he needed to have a credit on this piece of paper, which we didn't put in there, quite. Anyway, it's, the interesting thing is, I mean, one of the many, many interesting things, and one of the many really wonderful formulations for which I thank you and also Lee to a high degree, is this discrepancy between a territorial idea of language and, let's say, state language as a state and language as that which erodes the boundaries of the state or undoes them or challenges them. And yet all of you are writers who have to publish in something. So how do you reconcile the relationship between this often very lyrical and really ingenious ways in which the language shimmers in all of your presentations for different reasons, and yet you have to squeeze it into whatever the publisher asks you to do? Whoever wants to answer that question.
Actually, I'm not sure if I understand this. Can you say it in just 3 words? The same question?
Že hovorím, že kto štát chce, aby ste to robili vo vašom vlastnom jazyku.
Not in Slovak. No one understands Slovak here, except me. Sorry.
Yeah, but you publish in an alien language. Where you publish outside of the bounds of the state of the language in which you write. That was the question. Does it matter?
I didn't get it. Sorry.
Okay.
So what is the question?
The question is, does you write in Slovak, but you live in a Czech environment? Does it matter? Does it in any way? I mean, your proposition was in a way that the language is completely boundaryless, and yet you live in this seriously
Actually, I'm so happy.
State.
Okay, I understand your question. Yes, I write in Slovak, and I live in the Czech Republic, which is not that. I mean, those two languages are very similar, and usually Czechs understand Slovak, and Slovaks understand Czech. But actually, I'm so happy that I wrote this text in English now, because I can realize that I can really write in English. I wrote it in one day, and you know, if I would write the same text in Slovak, it would take me maybe 2 weeks to write it. And in English, I wrote it just in one day, and I think the quality is the same. Maybe it's even better.
Well, David, short's quality.
No. He did just very minor edits.
Okay.
I can show it to you if you don't believe me. So it's maybe it's I don't know, maybe it's because of this program,
right?
You know, or maybe it's because of Iowa City,
a non-state entity
itself, you know.
And anybody else who wants to talk about relationship between this fluid?
In my case, I write in Tigrinya, and my readers are the Eritreans in my country. But sometimes I think if the Tigrinya readers in Ethiopia try to read it, sometimes there is a different languages and usages of the grammars that has to be introduced for both the readers. So especially the cultural things are different, and sometimes some words are to the opposite of the words that I write when they are reading it. So I have to know, and I have to understand what I am writing in the Tigrinya. That's because I write no publishers for me.
That we've got to pursue that line of writing the opposite of what you intend to say. But I'm hoping that maybe, like Kuen and Amira, have something to say about.
Yeah, like I said, I have to acquire my written language. Some time ago at home, I have a heated debate with my ex-husband on whether the standard modern Chinese that we Cantonese people write is our native language or is a second language. For me, it's a half-half. I think it is a little bit of a second language. So I have to go to an acquired language in order to write. So sometimes when I write the other languages that I have learned, or Cantonese or English or even sometimes Japanese, will creep in my writing and make a sentence very weird with a lot of combinations. So I sometimes have to tame it. But in case of poetry, I will let them go wild. Yeah.
For a long time, I wrote only for theater, and The Reckoning of the Moon was my first novel. And the story set up in Gigel is my city. It was in the 17th century, and the city was called Gigeri. So, as I said in this text, I was working with the sailors and fishermen, and I really wanted to write it in this language. I write it in French. The book was published in Algeria. And people ask me why you didn't write it in Arabic. For me, it's not natural to write in Arabic. If I have to translate it, I will write it in the language of Gigel, because it's this kind of lingua franca, you know. And the problem was when I was writing in French that sometimes, you know, we don't have gender, male and female in Gigel. We have it in Arabic, but not in my first language. So how to translate it, how to write what is male, what is female, these questions were really a big issue for me, yeah.
Well, questions from the audience? I'm sure there are some.
Thank you for sharing your ideas and work with us. This question is for Samuel. I wonder, do you ever listen to BBC Amharic service? The correspondent is an IWP 17 participant. Christine Johannes. She got that appointment about 8 months ago. So if you listen to BBC Amharic, most likely you're going to be listening to her.
IWP, this
17, this group.
Is this in the residence?
Yes, a resident.
Wow, but this is new for me. When I was reading the... Yes, Ethiopia. Yeah, but in the IWP residence, which I got in the map of the IWP, I read only 3 writers before 1973. It's not her name or his name is not there in the map of the IWP. I don't know, but I have seen the Ba'alu Girma in 1973, and before him others too. But I know Ba'alu Girma. He wrote after he go to Ethiopia in 1993. He wrote Al-Walladim, and he died there because the government, the Haile Selassie government, doesn't like his writing, and he arrested and he died in prison. I know about Alu Girma's last. He was 1973, but I didn't know that you mentioned it.
You use BBC for information?
No. Yeah. Most of the time I see CNN.
I have a question for Chen Lai Kuen. Actually, I want to share my experience, even though, yes, I'm from mainland China and I speak Mandarin. But like you said, I don't know if I should consider it as my first language. Because, when I grow up, from 1 to 7, let's say, I would always speak dialect with my parents. So I also acquire the Mandarin language and then develop literacy when I go to school. So I can share your experience that, like in my school, since it's the countryside, even though they're required to speak Mandarin when they teach, but actually the reality is they speak the dialect when they're teaching us. But of course, the textbook is still like Mandarin. So I just want to share that and also share my own doubt, like what is my first language? And how do you count as your first language or not? Yeah.
Thank you for your experience. I think in Cantonese is a little bit different from the experience in China. It's because maybe in China or maybe other places, even if the dialect is widely used among family and friends, they are mainly remain kind of private. But in Hong Kong, the Cantonese is spoken on radio and television and plays and other more formal places. Just that when it's written, it's completely different. So that maybe that is a little bit of difference.
Yeah. I guess this goes to all of you. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentations. Does any of you feel like you have a responsibility on your language? And what does that entail if you do, and if you don't, why? And as a follow-up to that, when you write, do you feel that you're part of the language you're writing in, or you just use it as a tool?
In my case, I love words, and in my writing, I use I select words and try to express myself as exactly as I want. That's why I'm considering all the cultures and everything. Because of that, I write in Tigrinya, and in Tigrinya gives you a vast word selections for everything, for every purpose. We have different way of sayings. For example, if I said Qcha, Taita, Gogo, Hanza, and Hembasha, if I'm going to translate this, it only comes like round bread. Yeah, but it's different 5. So language helps you. You have to know the language and the culture. When I say that, And if you come into English, for ice, snow, glacier, freeze, and frost, we call it only barad. So culture is, because words are tools to give the culture, to express what you want in the mind of your characters. I don't feel that I have to take a responsibility of my language, but I know the characters are in my culture and in my language. So if I am going to express that character, I have to use perfect words. That's why I use language.
Okay, can I say something? Actually, I wrote it in my essay that to me, writing is a way of thinking. And it means that actually writing for me is much more than just talking. And it is, for example, one of the reasons why writing is more for me than just speaking or talking is that I have much more time to think before I write something. So, for example, when I was writing this text, I had time to think about every sentence before I wrote it. So, yeah, it's the opposite of spontaneous, of something spontaneous. You know, when you talk, you can say anything. You can say all kind of stupid things. But when you write, you are thinking. It is what I do when I write. I try to think. And writing is helping me. And for example, when I wrote this in English, the English language itself helped me to write it as it is written. So it's very important which language you use and how you know to work with it. And I was just surprised that, because my spoken English is very bad, as you can hear, but it's not that important. What is important is that each language can enable you to think somehow, you know, and that's very interesting to me.
Thank you very much. I have a question. When you write in different languages or think in different languages, do you feel you have different personalities when you put down on paper? Because personally, I speak Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, and English and German. I feel I have different personalities. Even when I write in Mandarin Chinese, when I publish in Taiwan or publish in mainland China, the paper itself will also, academic paper, but it would also be different because of different vocabulary, and maybe different places would use different sets of theoretical framework. So I'm personally aware of myself being different when I speak different languages. I'm just very curious about your experience. Yeah, all of
everyone?
you. Yes.
Okay. Yes, it's an interesting question. For example, I live in the Czech Republic for more than 20 years. And I did a couple of attempts to write in Czech, and it was really not easy for me. I can write in Czech, but mentally I cannot get into the language as much as I can get mentally into my own language. So my own language enables me to express myself, like, let's say, fully, more full spectrum, let's say, of emotions, or especially emotions. Because ideas, I can write ideas also in Czech, but usually even when I write ideas, I'm trying to combine them with some emotional background, let's say. And so in that sense, language is very important, because it's even ideas are not only about ideas, but they are also about colors, about the dynamics, about how the melody of how they are said, and and music of them. And every language has its own music, of course. And for example, the music of Slovak language is totally different from the music of Czech language. The Czech language is, let's say, if I simplify it, is closer to German from the point of view of music, and Slovak language is closer to Russian. So it's totally different. I'm simplifying, yes, but I feel it like this. I feel it like this. You don't have to agree with me. I'm not the linguist. I don't want to be a linguist. I'm just using language in my own way. You don't have to agree with me.
But I think you are right. I feel different, But while I'm writing fiction, I have to think like the character. So I have to come back to myself and think how the character thinks. So because of that, I am from Tigrinya, and Tigrinya is well known in the world. But we have lot of things that if a man tries to hit his wife and she runs to Ushate and he stops, it will be amazing for the other culture who knows other cultures. But in my culture, he has to. A man doesn't go to the private room of his wife. She has a private room. Everything she puts there, and if a man enters in that room, everybody in that language, in that culture, he insults him, and he's not a man. You see, there in one Hudmo, in one area, but she runs to her room. He never crosses the gate. And everything she has there is, she has suwa, the local drink. She give him every day when he comes, but he doesn't know how much she has. And she collects some grains for the other time. He don't know what she has inside. He knows what they have together, but like a mother is the responsible person in that house. So if I write about this mother, and I am writing it in English, it cannot be different, because I have to think about the culture. So there is escape for that thinking.
I do have different personalities when I write in different languages. I think in English I may be more on the intellectual side, but less on the emotional side, and vice versa. But I would like to explain a little bit of the situation when I write in the standard modern Chinese, because it is kind of, I acquired it partly from school, and then when I started writing, I acquired the styles from different writers, so it is more literary. So taking Robert's metaphor of in an aquarium, it is not as natural as a fish in an aquarium. Probably I am the fish inside, but the water is a little bit cold. And taking his metaphor of love, maybe I need to be in love all the time, but in that linguistic situation is that because there's some distance between me and the language, or it may be like in a situation that the loved person is a little bit drifting always from me, and I have to chase him, something like that. Yes.
I don't feel different, because I think I feel different when I'm writing because of my characters. So I try to live what they are living. So all the time I have many characters in my head. And when I'm writing, I live this situation every day. In some moments I have to speak in French, in others I have to speak in Arabic, and otherwise, when I'm in Gigel or in city, when I change cities, I change my way of speaking, and so I think it's like in my DNA. I'm all the time changing languages when I change the place. So it's the same when I write. And I want to say something that Claire France helped me for translation too. Sorry, I forget the credit.
I question for all you guys. During your writing, would you try to find your own language?
What?
Yes, actually. I wrote it somewhere. I cannot find it here, but I wrote it here. Where is it?
May I
Yes,
answer?
yes, that after I started to write, I started to enjoy being trapped in words in the language I was creating from the language I knew. It means that when you are writing, you are always creating your own language, your idiosyncratic language, which is only yours. And all good writers, they have to have their own language by which they are recognizable. And it's also kind of existential or experiential thing, you know. You cannot buy it anywhere. Or you cannot learn it. You cannot learn it anywhere except in your own inner experience.
Would it be fair, Nick, to modify that to say idiolect? Because I think when you say language, it really has to do with the question of translation and understandability. But idiolect has to do with the combination of experience, voice, linguistic range in your head, the selection that you have at your fingertips from which you can choose. I wonder if the term would be more idiolect?
No. It's something totally different, I think. It's a linguistic term which does not saying this, what I'm saying now.
Well, no, I mean... Well, I'm just wondering about whether the language can be entirely original and personal, or whether you still have to maintain some linguistic connection.
No, of course.
Well, that's
if you want to communicate, then
well, that's exactly what I meant. So there's a communication level,
you need
and
to
then
communicate
there's the second
when
level.
you write. And I don't know. Most of
Maybe
the writers they want to communicate, and it is why they write. No, I don't know. I write because I want to communicate.
Yeah, but in my, I am not in that level, I say, because I wrote a review about one book. I think nobody read that book. It's in Tigrinya, because he uses different, his own creation of words, and he's right when he explains. He's right, and that was fiction. But he made 140 glossaries in the back of the book, and when I read that book, it gives me something that what I don't know and what I cannot do. So I started to write a review about it, and I wrote because he creates some words like lift. We don't have a word in Tigrinya, lift. But he created a word, saflalit, and he created a word better than lift. That means saflalit means that goes up and down. There's a lot of words he created, but it's not understood because of the story and something like that. But he has the power to create words, and I learned from him how to create words. And sometimes I try to use, but I'm not successful until now.
Every time I started to write, because I just said the standard modern Chinese for me is a little bit of a second language. So actually, every time I try to write, it is a process of selection. I need to select a voice for myself. For example, because I've acquired it through like reading, so when I write, I have to select from different voices that barges into my head. Sometimes if I read a writer too much, I will start to write like him or her. So I will have to select. For example, should I write like a Taiwan style or mainland style or a newspaper style in Hong Kong or other different styles? So it is a kind of battle between different voices in my head always.
In my case, I didn't find, and I think if I find, I will stop writing. And for me, each book, each play, or each story I'm writing, I'm making research, on the language, and that's how I'm writing, and that's what, for me, it's interesting. And really, I think if I find something, if I'm sure of something, I will just stop writing.
Well, that may be the perfect place to stop. It's 1 o'clock, so I thank you very much. And we hope to see you again 2 weeks from now. Thank you.